Okay, thank you very much, Erica. I appreciate that kind introduction, and welcome to all of you. Glad you're able to be here today. I first want to thank Erica for inviting me to speak about this subject here today, and want to thank the European School of Theosophy for opening up their forum to talk about something that we don't always get to hear a lot of in these type of forums, and that is a bit about our shared history as theosophists. It's something that we don't always discuss in these type of situations. So I'm grateful for them to allow me to have this opportunity to share some things about this episode of our history. So what was the case against William Cronjudge all about? Well, this episode is very broad and it's very, very complex and it has many, many layers to it. So obviously we're just going to review certain aspects of it here today. So to get an overview, let's see if I can get my mouse to change. And it's not allowing me to change my screen here.
Well, try minimizing the screen and changing the slides by clicking on the left where you see the small slides of PowerPoint.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I may have to stop sharing here.
Yeah, you can stop sharing.
Sorry. So you're asking me to. Oh, goodness.
Yeah.
Okay, hold on just a second.
Perhaps you should choose. You should choose the option share, advanced.
Yeah, hang on.
And then portion of screen.
Sorry about this.
It's okay. We are all learning.
Yes, how about this?
Yeah, we can see that very well.
I better you can see everything else too. All right. So yeah, but you may not be able to see the whole. There we go. I have to play with it a little bit.
Yeah. Why don't you try that option I suggested?
Okay. Okay. Yeah. All right. So just a little synopsis of what we're going to review today here is I just want to give a little backgrounds about why history, why we might want to study history, and how it can be important for us to learn something about who we are as theosophists, to better understand that and to better understand why we have so many different groups in the Theosophical Society today. Then I'm going to give a brief synopsis of the 1895 split or separation of the American section from the international headquarters in Adyar, India in 1895. This will be the Cliff Notes version of it. If you all know what Cliff Notes are, these little Cliff Notes are those little books in America. Maybe they have them in other countries too, where that are just fairly condensed and abridged versions of larger works. So this will be the Cliff Notes version of it. And the overview will especially be related to some of the topics that we'll discuss on the next item, that is about issues that arose from this area. There are two examples. One is we will discuss how spiritual authority came to the fore through this episode, and also the impact of the different governance structures between the society at large and the Eastern School of Theosophy. So that's a synopsis of what we're going to cover. So why history? Why do we want to get into this, and why should we get into this? So to sort of set the tone for our discussions today, I think it's important that we understand what the nature of history is, and also to understand that how we talk about history, it can be just as important as discussing the history itself. The language that we use to talk about history is just as important. So, and I think by doing so that we can better understand, again, who we are and where so many of our different groups come from. And we do have so many groups today that luckily we have a lot of networking that goes on and sharing that goes on with our groups. But for me, at least, the question has always arisen throughout my theosophical career, as it were, where do these different groups come from? And I've always been curious to know something about where they do come from. So that led me to sort of explore, in this case, everything, all the different threads seem to lead back to this period in the history of the society where a lot of these groups came from. So it led me to go to this period in the society's history. And since all the different groups work so harmoniously today, why bring up this past? Why bring up something that was so difficult in the past? I've throughout the many years, I've heard people say, this is the past, let it go. Why bring it up? Why kick up the old dust, as it were, and why go over these issues again? Well, I think that these issues and the issues that came forward have a lesson that we can still learn from today if we do it in the appropriate way. So I will be listing some of those issues, but we're only going to deal with two of them, as I noted earlier in the synopsis there. So, and also just to let you know, as Erica mentioned, my background, I do come from belonging to several of these groups. So again, that history to me was very important. And though we are a long, long way, obviously, from previous generations after the initial split, but at the time that this occurred, this period, it divided sections, it divided families, and it divided, friends in society. So it had its moments. But if we can discuss it, in a non-judgmental way with the distance that we have today, and with a lot of humility, I think that we can gain something from this studying of this period. And let's see, so I'm gonna go to the next slide. So I think you all probably are familiar with this quote from George Santayana. He was the Spanish philosopher and poet and essayist, and you probably have heard this in one rendition or the other. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And though it is a very familiar phrase and it may seem trite and almost cliched, but I still think that it makes a valid and an important and appropriate point that we should not become, amnesiacs, and we should not want to have a historical amnesia, because I do believe that studying our history can help us better understand who we are today, and just to understand the culture of the different theosophical groups, because there are some differences between the different theosophical organizations, and that comes from somewhere. And so by studying some of our history, we can gain a better understanding of one another. And as we get into this, some of my slides had little dissolves and effects, so there's going to be some interesting issues coming up on some of the other slides, but we'll do our best to get through those. So just to go through my approach on this, again, my intention of this was to be as neutral as possible in trying to present this. My early theosophical experience in this occurred here in California, especially in Southern California, where you have representatives of all three of the different groups that I belong to, and others belong to as well in Southern California. But the lodge that I was with was a very, pro-judge lodge at the time. And I noticed that the language they used affect the way that they presented the history of Judge and his involvement in this period. And also that goes the same for Besant and for Colonel Olcott. I noticed that, they were very polar in many ways. And I thought, gee whiz, I can't believe that this is everything that there is to say about these people. So I wanted to sort of peel back the layers and find out in a more objective manner, in a way that was try to be as non-judgmental as possible of what might be going on in this period. Because I thought some of the language used was kind of biased in a way towards any of those people. And so I just thought, there had to be something else going on if we just, if I dug deeper into it. So, and I think, maybe as a Scorpio, I'm a Scorpio born in November. I like lifting up the rocks, right? And looking under and seeing what's underneath the rocks. That's something that I have always been interested in doing. I like investigating things and researching into things and solving puzzles. So this was definitely a puzzle for me, this period, to be able to look into it and to spend the time that I did doing that. So, so in doing so, you know, sometimes treading on sensitive or challenging history can be like, you know, treading on eggshells sometimes. And, you know, that's something that you want to do, you may want to do lightly and feel like you're want to be careful how you present things and talk about things and you know, how you get into the subject and how you get into study the subject depends on your previous knowledge that you bring to it, you know, that you start bringing to it. So, you know, we all have our assumptions, we all have our biases, and we all have our loyalties. And so, you know, those layers, some of those layers I needed to peel back to just be able to look at the evidence itself, just look at the documentation that I had available to me to try to explore this issue and to have a better sense of, you know, some of the things might be going on here. So in number 3 there, you know, my approach again was to better understand who we are as Theosophists, to gain a better understanding of who the members were in the 1890s, either as leaders and general members. And I also wanted to recognize, and it became evident to me that while the Theosophical Society has been inspired by the masters and it has very aspiring, has amazing literature, but it was also left to be developed by, you know, very wonderful, brilliant, pioneering people, but they are also very human people. You know, they're very much human beings and had the same human characteristics that we all have and the same challenges that we all have, despite the accolades that history has put upon them and recognized them for. So I wanted to have a better understanding of how the different Theosophical societies and their related groups, you know, how did their own culture emerge and where do they originate from, but also to have a better understanding of the evolution of the teachings given out by Blavatsky and the masters, you know, after her death, because nothing is static. And after Blavatsky passed away, you know, the teachings continued to be developed and interpreted and commented upon, et cetera, by future leaders in all the different organizations. So, and I think, though, also by understanding who these people are, we get a more three-dimensional view of them. Because, let's see, we'll go into the next slide. So, my interest in theosophical history, again, was to better understand how individuals dealt with the challenges that they were confronted with, both personal and societal, as members of the society, as they sought to fulfill their spiritual aspirations, you know, and to implement the objects of the Theosophical Society. So, despite the society's 3 objects, especially its first object, universal brotherhood, there have been a number of contentious periods. You know, we have to admit that in both the Adyar TS and the Point Loma TS. And you know, if we can look at these objectively, and again, with a lot of humility for the work that was done by our past pioneers in the movement, but to be able to recognize both what they did, the challenges that they had to meet as they were continuing to work in the society and help the society grow, the movement grow. Number 7. So the title that we typically associate with this episode, called The Judge Case, or The Case Against William Quan Judge. The Judge Case was a title given to it by Henry Still Olcott. It was given in a report that he gave, I believe, in 1889, when he gave a very long history as a rebuttal to the history that the American section gave as their rationale as to why they would split off. So at the next Adyar convention, Olcott addresses their history with his history of the development of the society, and it's here that he applies this label, the Judge Case, to that. And you know, I have preferred not to use either that as a label for this era, either the Judge case or the case against William Quan Judge, since this kind of language sort of sets up a duality between a protagonist and antagonist. And I believe that this era is more complex than that, and that the people involved in it are more complex. So I tend to, I know we refer to it a lot as that, but I tend to avoid using that title as much as possible as a label for this era. So the separation as well of the American section from Adyar, we can consider it really as a nexus, or something that ties other groups back to a certain point in time. And that also, you know, sort of connects us together in a way. So, and I think that idea is embodied in a statement that the former historian John Cooper made. He said that just as the Cologne conspiracy became a barrier to the general acceptance of theosophy to the world outside of the Theosophical movement, so the Judge case, which also centered on letters from the Mahatmas, is the key point to the divisions within the Theosophical movement. And I think that's a pretty good summary of insight about this episode of connecting either directly or indirectly a lot of the current groups that we know today, have today, and know today. So. So go back to the top, challenge of history. All right. So if I had to label anything about this period, if I had to give it a sexy or fancy title, I would probably label this period as the society's occult civil war. Occult because the real divisions in this period really start within the Eastern School of Theosophy, and civil war because, you know, it turned brother against brother at the time, and it set brother to struggle against fellow brother theosophists at this time. So it really was a sort of a civil strife that occurred within the organization at that time in the 1890s. And if I can use an analogy, like a rock thrown into a pond, the so-called Judge case has created ripples that continue to reverberate throughout the cultures, I think, of many of the different theosophical organizations or not, whether they are recognized or not. And if I can extend that water-based analogy, I would also say that the Judge case is like an underground river that links the remaining theosophical organizations together with our common heritage and our common dilemmas that we may have moving forward. And we'll get a sense of some of those here in a few minutes. So let us start with a synopsis. This is my little Cliff Notes version, just to review the split in between 1891 and 1895. And I thought we would start with a photograph here. And as we know, a photograph, you know, is worth 1,000 words, but I'm going to try to keep it under 1,000 for sure. So, so this photograph was taken in the summer of 1891. It is in the backyard of the Blavatsky Lodge, where the leaders were meeting after Blavatsky's death. It's taken in the summer of 1891, which was several months after the death of Madame Blavatsky, which you know was on May the 8th of 1891. So Besant was returning to London from the US when Blavatsky passed away. She was in the middle of the ocean when that occurred. And when she got back, Judge had wired her to leave all the papers as they were, blah, 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 but he was going to come to London. So he said he's going to come to London to meet with Besant and also to meet with HPB's EST Council. And Olcott at this time, this photograph is actually taken a little later than May or June, but Olcott, when Blavatsky passed away, was in Australia, and he would not arrive until early July. Olcott is, as many of you know, he is the president of the Theosophical Society. And up to this time, Judge had 3 titles. He was the vice president of the society. He was the general secretary of the American section at that time. And he was HPB's EST secretary for North America for the Eastern School of Theosophy. And Besant was the president of the Blavatsky Lodge at this time. And she was also, with a very long title, she was also the chief secretary of the inner group of the esoteric section and recorder of his teachings. So the inner group was a smaller group of personal pupils within the EST that Blavatsky took under her wing to give additional instruction to. So these were really the three main leaders in the society after Blavatsky died, and two of these, of course, were the founders. Olcott and Judge were the two remaining founders at this time. So, and Besant had met Judge originally in America. She had gone in April. She had went to America for the first time to give her first tour in the northeastern states of the United States. And she and Judge hit it off really well. They developed a really good relationship. You know, they're both very sharp people, very bright. Besant admired Judge's managerial skills, and Judge obviously admired Besant's oratorical skills and her knowledge of theosophy. So they really did. They start off with a very good relationship. When they meet in London here to discuss, they basically want to discuss the future of the Eastern School of Theosophy. However, Judge and Olcott had a little more testy relationship, and a lot of this, and this had occurred prior to Blavatsky's death, and a lot of their challenges with each other centered around Olcott's attitude towards HBB and her role within the TS that Judge didn't always agree with. And so you'll find out there's a letter I'm going to quote from later that they had a little testier relationship. They butted heads sometimes. So, and prior to Blavatsky's death, all three of these people also claim have contacts with the masters of the Mahatmas, and had claimed to have received messages from them, and they will continue to do so throughout this period. So, all right. So during that same summer of 1893, or 1891, excuse me, once Olcott arrives in London, this is the period when he initially becomes suspicious of receiving some messages that had a seal on it that he claimed was a seal that he had made for Blavatsky in India many years later in the 1880s. And so he became suspicious of why this seal mark, and it had a flaw on it that he said that distinguished it from what he considered to be the Mahatma's true seal. And so seeing this flawed seal mark on these letters that he was receiving from Judge made him suspicious of Judge's messages themselves. And before I go further, I want to mention too, under Besant and Judge, where it says interim co-heads of the EST, need to point out that when Judge and Besant were appointed as co-heads of the EST, they considered their position to be interim or temporary. And this is stated in the EST circular that they sent out on May the 27th, after the EST council met and decided that they would continue with the EST, that it should continue. And they didn't elect, but they decided that based on some documents that Besant and Judge presented to the council, they decided that they would serve together and as partners, as co-heads of the Eastern School of Theosophy. And the circular on May the 27th, it does specifically and explicitly mentions that they would be interim heads until what they considered the true head or the true teacher would return in the future, that they would remain as interim heads until that teacher returned. The circular does not describe how the teacher will return. It doesn't describe how that person will be recognized in that document, but until that time occurred, they would serve as interim heads. So, and that's what they considered themselves to be at that time. So moving along in 1893, the World Parliament of Religions occurred. This was a great boon for Theosophy and presenting Theosophy to the public, and this is taking place in Chicago, Illinois. And it was a great event for the Theosophists to present theosophical ideas. And at this time, along with the Theosophical delegates, their judge had asked for representatives from both the Buddhist and the Hindu traditions to accompany them. And there are two individuals. The Buddhist tradition was represented by Dharmapala, who was with them, and the Brahmin member that was selected by suggested by Bertram Keatley was Garendranath Chakravarti. And so both of them attend the parliament as well with the Theosophical group. And during this period, it is during this period that Besant that now also becomes suspicious of the Mahatma letters to Judge. She initially was not suspicious in 1891 and 1892 because people did discuss this with her earlier, that they were concerned about some of these messages, but she said that they really didn't have enough evidence. And, you know, at this time, her relationship with Judge was such that she wasn't willing to believe that that would be a problem with him. But it wasn't until 1893 that she begins to change her opinion on this. And she now is also becoming a little more suspicious of these letters, the Mahatma letters that Judge occasionally sends out. So this leads to the following summer in 1894, Besant prepares a brief against Judge to be presented to the Society's Judicial Committee in London. So Judge goes to London, and when the Judicial Committee is meeting, Judge presents some demurs, which are a legal term for objections as to why the Society cannot really adjudicate on issues of who, as Judge put it, who is someone's teacher, and your relationship with that teacher is not something that the Society itself is able to adjudicate on. It would go against the bylaws of the Society, and the Judicial Committee, which Olcott was a part, agreed with that. And so they never really review those charges at all. And there is, I think, let me go to my notes because I'm getting ahead of myself here, note-wise. There is, however, a vote that's taken by the European section, because they have their convention around the same time after the Judicial Committee met in London. And the European section voted unanimously, sort of as a committee of honor for the Society, on the resolutions that Judge could not be tried as the vice president. And those were the charges. The charges were saying he was abusing his position as the vice president. But the European section voted unanimously that he could not be, that the bylaws of the TS prevent the Society from voting on any member who claims to be a spiritual teacher or even having a relationship with one of the masters. So they hope that this whole thing will be buried, you know, and whatnot, and that they will go on with their theosophical activities. But one of the other fallouts of this was that Besant and Judge segregate their leadership roles in the EST. So at this time, after this period, Judge would become the head, or later it would be known as the outer head of the American continent. And then Besant would continue to be the head of Europe and India as well. So they are splitting and segregating their roles at that point. Okay. Now, this next slide is going to look funny because I wanted to do some effects, which I'm not going to be able to do for you because I wanted to show you in the fall of 1894, and I did this all on one slide. I can say I shouldn't do that again in the future, but I was going to show you a picture of the Westminster Gazette, which is buried behind that EST picture there. in the order that these would have been presented to you. But in the fall of 1894, just a few months after the Judicial Committee had met in that summer, the Westminster Gazette releases, excuse me, a series of articles based on many of the documents that Besant wanted to present to the Judicial Committee. The documents were leaked to one of the editors of the Westminster Gazette, Edmund Garrett, by Walter Old. They had Walter Old knew Garrett, and Walter Gordon Old had a copy, a set of many of the documents that Besant wanted to present to the Judicial Committee, and he turns those over for various reasons. He wasn't satisfied with the outcome and thought that Old thought that the outcome basically showed that the society wasn't able to really face this issue appropriately. So he thought that by giving these documents over to the Westminster Gazette and having them published in the Westminster Gazette, that it would force the society to deal with these issues. And in a way, he was right, it did, but not in the way that he intended, unfortunately. So they ran the serial expose in the Westminster Gazette about Judge's, the claim that Judge was forging these Mahatma letters. And it's a series that ran from October through about the middle of November. And so it was basically like throwing gas on a simmering coals from the European Convention, and it made people want to, it revived this issue again to want to investigate Judge again. And of course, the document that really ignites the flames again, which you can kind of see a part of here, was an EST document that Judge releases on November the 3rd. And it's going to be hard for you to see, but there's a heading here, and it says by master's direction. So he is claiming that he has been directed by the master to release this circular. And one of the main things that the circular does is that Judge, by sort of fiat, but through the master's direction, declares that Annie Besant's role as a head of the EST is abolished. He was basically saying, Annie Besant, you're fired. So you can imagine some of the blowback that will occur from that, having made that. This document it's a fascinating document. It's very provocative, and obviously and to say controversial is putting it mildly. And there's some very strong statements in it. We're not going to review them all just because it's a little off. Some of it's a little off topic. We are going to come back to it a little later, but not go into it in depth. It'll get us off track here. So, and so in April of 1895, the American section meets for their annual convention at that time. And during that convention, they decide that they are going to declare what they call their autonomy from the international headquarters in Adyar, which they do by a majority of votes. It wasn't unanimous. There were some that did not want to separate away from Adyar, the international headquarters there, but a majority of lodges and members did vote to separate. Then in 1895, Olcott declares that the American section's separation was a succession from the International Theosophical headquarters. And I use these two terms because these are the terms that they used. And they used the term either autonomy or seceding to declare the separation was based on how each side told the story of the society's history up to this point. The American section declaring their autonomy is based on how they presented the history to the American section before the vote. And again, in the following year, at the end of 1895, I believe it is, Olcott presents his version of the history of the society's development to show that from his perspective that the American section seceded from Adyar. So again, language is important, and how they use that language, but also how they tell the story of the history is important. And they told very different versions of the history, and that would be a whole nother talk to give. It's a fascinating area to go into, as well as how they both tell that history of the society up to this time, to use the word autonomy or seceding or succession at that time. All right, so next slide. So some of the issues that arose during the 1890s, here are some of them. So some of the issues that arose throughout this 4 or 5 year period was Eastern versus Western occult methods of development, spiritual authority and how that authority is used, was the schism either being labeled autonomy or succession. Fourth, the contrarian histories of the society's early development, again, as I mentioned, expressed by Judge and Olcott. The different governance structures between the society at large and the Eastern School of Theosophy. This is an interesting one too. I found it came up, several people would discuss this throughout this period, especially G.R.S. Mead. He was one who discussed this quite a bit. It was the role of reason or intuition, or versus intuition. It doesn't have to be versus one or the other, but it was the role of reason or intuition as a means to verify one's conviction in a Mahatma's message. This was an issue that came up. Just to briefly say something here, just to give some context to that, why I'm mentioning that is obviously a lot of members have never had any contact with the Mahatmas, and how were they to determine when Mahatma messages were released, either to them personally or through other means? How were they to verify the veracity of that message? Was it just because the recipient of it said it's a message and this is what you need to do, or what? So Mead brings this up a number of times, especially if you get into the issues about whether Judge did or did not forge the messages. It comes up as an element of that discussion with them. And then lastly, the relationship of Besant and Judge with Gian Chakravarti. They both did, Besant is the one who's probably more well-known, who had developed a relationship with Chakravarti, especially once she tours India in 1893. But because of the Parliament, and Judge, of course, met Chakravarti and was taken by him as well, and found him to be an interesting person. And initially he tries to develop a relationship with Chakravarti as well. The reason behind that was because Judge wanted to have more Indians participate in sending journal articles and possibly coming to the United States to give tours across the United States. So he was hoping Chakravarti might be able to do that, but that didn't really work out. And though I don't list it here, I'm going to bring it up. There is one other person in this period that deserves mention, and I probably should have put a little bullet there for it, and this is Catherine Tingley. We're not really going to get into her. I'm not going to say really much about her, but Judge and Catherine Tingley have a relationship that's also very much worth exploring in this period as well, but that would be another time. So what I was going to do in this next slide was, which I can't really do, is we're going to begin to talk about now the two issues that I mentioned in our overview, just to go through some examples of to illustrate how these two issues, spiritual authority and the governance between the Theosophical Society and the esoteric section at large, how these evolve throughout this period. I was going to have an effect that made that little picture get smaller and it would reveal the second subject, but we'll just go on with the first one, spiritual authority. So 14, getting ahead of my slide here. So with HBB's passing from the scene, some members in the public were now wondering how would the Theosophical Society continue without her? And would the Mahatmas would the Mahatmas continue to be involved with leaders in the society? So, and how would they continue, or would they continue to help with the society? There was actually a concern about this when Blavatsky passed away, because she was considered to be the main conduit, amanuensis of the Mahatmas' messages and their teachings and that so forth. So statements, though, so to address these concerns and issues, there are some statements that occurred in the path here in the United States. And Besant addresses it in London as well, and others such as Julia Keatley. This is the beginning of a page from the path of an article written by Julia Keatley, or Julia Verplanck as she was known at this time. She later marries Archibald Keatley, the London Theosophist, and hence becomes Julia Keatley. She's also known by, to make it even more complicated for her, she's also known by the nom de plume Jasper Neiman. A lot of her articles in the path are under the name Jasper Neiman. So she submitted this article to the path. It doesn't really have a title, but it's kind of known in theosophical circles as the Theosophical Education, because the article talks about how even though HPB is gone, that we as Theosophists can, sort of pick up the torch, carry on, and continue to present her teachings as they were given to them, to continue to further, theosophical ideas and the theosophical mission. But above her article, she inserts this. You see, this is triangle in these sort of in bold. She inserts a message from the Mahatma. And the message says, ingratitude is not one of our faults. And that's in quotation marks. So it seems to be referring to something, or an earlier statement of that similar idea. And it goes on to say, we always help those who help us. Tact, discretion, and zeal are more than ever needed. The humblest worker is seen and helped. So, and then the three triangles, you see those three triangles are typically a sign of Mahatmic. A lot of the Mahatma messages, and HVB uses that, those three dots in the triangle as well, sort of representing the higher self and also the higher source of the message. So this message is conveying that, in a sense, we're not abandoning you. When the student is ready, the master will come, and that they are there to help as needed. So. And I just want to, let's see, I don't think yeah, okay. So, and Blavatsky, or not Blavatsky, excuse me, sorry, nervous, tongue-tied. Besant also addresses this issue as well. She gives a lecture to was her last lecture actually that she gave to the National Secular Society in August of 1893. It was later published in an article and in this pamphlet form as a fragment of autobiography. And in it, she claims to have received messages from the Mahatmas after HPB died. So she was trying to indicate to her listeners and to the general broad theosophical public that the masters were still with the society and they were working through people such as her. And some of these Mahatmic messages at this time that she, up to this time, excuse me, that she claims to have received, while she doesn't say it here in this pamphlet, she'll say it later in some other documents. She'll say that some of these earlier messages after Blavatsky died that she claims to have received were sent through Judge. So you have, and even Judge writes another article in the Path, which I don't have any illustration here. It's called "Are We Deserted?" And he talks about the Mahatmas who say, no, we have not been deserted, that, the movement will continue on. So Julia Keatley, Annie Besant, Judge are submitting these articles to the theosophical public to let them know that the work will continue, the mission will survive, the society will survive, the mission is going to continue, and there's no need to worry. Okay. So I want to give some examples of how spiritual authority during this period is used to either justify or rationalize the positions that either Annie Besant or Judge take. So first we have this quote, in a letter to an unnamed recipient in July the 2nd, 1891, Besant says to her recipient, this is just soon after she has been appointed as a co-head with Judge of the Eastern School of Theosophy. And the member apparently was expressing doubt as to why Besant was selected. And this is Besant's response. She says, if I could, I would say to you, my dear, and the name has been left out, sign only to Mr. Judge. I should be quite content, for indeed there is no reason why you should have any confidence in me. Only as they, referring to the masters, have put us together, I have no power to stand aside. So she's using the master's authority here as a reason that even though this student was suspicious of why Besant should be considered an outer head, she's using the master's authority to justify why she is one of the outer heads. And by the master's authority, in part what she is referring to as well here, when the council, ESD council decided to let Annie Besant and William Quan Judge serve as co-heads, they had, Annie Besant had found a slip of paper and all of the stacks of paper that she was using as evidence to give to the council as to why they should continue the EST and who might be the interim heads. Her and Besant, there was a message from the master found in it, and the message basically says Judge's plan is right. And so it turns out that it was probably Judge who suggested that they should be co-heads at that time. So this master's note was verifying that. So that's what Besant is addressing in this little excerpt here, is that it's the masters that have put them together. So whether you choose to follow me, is up to you, the recipient of this letter, but this is why I'm in this position. And Judge does something very similar too. In a letter to Olcott, again, as I said, they had a bit of a testy relationship, which is reflected in this letter that Judge writes to Olcott several years later in August of 1893. And he says in part in this letter, he says to Olcott, I do not mean that I want you to think that I am in love with you, but want you to feel it possible that this whole game, so far as I am concerned, is played by master and not by me. For I tell you, I will keep in the work with you no matter what occurs until master withdraws. So here Judge is saying that he's going to use the authority of the master, that if the master says that Judge should withdraw, that he's going to, by withdrawal, I think this is alluding to possibly separating away from the international headquarters even at this time. But there really wasn't much of a split considered at this time, but as it would lead to. But Olcott and Judge did have their challenges, and it's possible that that Judge would at the least decided not to work with Olcott as closely as he had in the past from this point, and uses the master's statement as justification for that rationale. Okay, so next. So also, besides invoking the masters, sometimes Blavatsky would be evoked as an authority to support either Judge's or Besant's position. And this was done by Archibald Keatley, for example, in a long ESD circular that he writes late into this episode in 1895 in January. Let's see, and he, and this was written after the November ESD circular by Judge appeared. And as people started critiquing it, which they did very heavily, this is a response to those critiques by Archibald Keatley as to why Judge was justified in writing that circular. And I don't know, let me see if I have the quotes. Yes, I do, okay. So basically, he invokes Blavatsky as a means to defend Judge by highlighting Blavatsky's statements about Judge's status prior to her death. So one of the things he brings up was Judge was discussed by Blavatsky in the EST instructions number 3 and the preliminary explanations. And these were some additions actually to the preliminary memorandum that was originally written at the beginning of the EST, which were basically some rules and guidelines that members needed to follow as members of that group. And Judge was highlighted throughout that section for his leadership role in the EST and how Blavatsky was depending upon Judge to serve as a secretary in America. So basically Keatley is supporting Judge by quoting Blavatsky's support and need for Judge in the EST at that time. And then Blavatsky also mentioned that Judge had served the masters for many lifetimes in those instructions. And so if he had done that, then obviously, he's a capable person. And he wouldn't do anything, he wouldn't do anything so inconvenience and trite as in that circular. And Blavatsky was writing to Judge, noting that Judge's astral had blended with the Nirmanakaya. So this is part of the tradition of Judge's life that Blavatsky claims that Judge had this higher influence from this Nirmanakaic influence. The Nirmanakaya is one of the robes of the Buddha. It comes from the Buddha. This comes from the Buddhist tradition. If you read The Voice of the Silence, it's mentioned in there, and you get an understanding of what the Nirmanakaya is about. So this higher influence, though, all we need to know for this sake is that the Nirmanakaya is this higher influence, and Judge was associated with this higher influence. So, if Judge is writing something, he's writing it through the guide, through higher guidance to justify that November 3rd, 1894 circular, according to Keatley here, according to Keatley. All right. But it happens both ways. The Countess Wachtmeister, who is a big supporter of Besant during this period, writes a pamphlet called H.P. Blavatsky and the Present Crisis in the Theosophical Society. And this is one of the critiques against that November 3rd circular that was released. And this came out in early March of 1895. And here she's coming, of course, to Besant's defense of some of the claims that Judge had made, and especially her release from the EST as the outer head. And so what some of those were, so Wachtmeister, invoked Blavatsky as a means to defend Besant by highlighting Blavatsky's statements that are used to demote Judge's status now. So Keatley had used them to bolster his status. Wachtmeister now is pulling statements from Blavatsky that are meant to demote Judge's status and yet to bolster Besant's status as a result. So Wachtmeister quotes from Blavatsky saying that Judge was not going to progress much occultly in this life since he had, quote, failed in one of his early trials. And then Blavatsky was also said to say that poor Judge, he is his own worst enemy. So if he's his own worst enemy, he can get himself in trouble sometimes, right? Possibly. And HBB also was supposed to have said that Judge is a good administrator, but he will not progress much occultly in this life. So again, these are trying to demote and reduce Judge's role. Wachtmeister also claimed that Blavatsky said that her successor would be a woman. And HBB also apparently said that Besant is soon coming very near to the master. And actually she does say it, it's in a letter that we have, that Besant is coming soon coming very near to the master and hears from him directly. So, so you see this jostling that's going on back and forth between these two different groups defending Besant or Judge through this period, using these various authorities to do so, to help them do so. And Besant and Judge themselves also invoked Blavatsky to support their own positions. Besant does this in an EST circular written December the 19th in 1894. And here she's responding as a co-head to Judge's November 3rd circular. She, of course, refuses to step down. She's not going to release that title by any means. She's going to stand on her ground and her position. She invokes Blavatsky as a means to claim that her role as Blavatsky's successor, and Besant says in this circular that she was designated by Blavatsky to be her successor in the EST. And what Besant is referring to is a letter that was read to the EST Council in 1891 as evidence why she and Judge should be co-heads. It's a letter that Blavatsky had written to Judge in March 27th of 1891. Interesting letter, and in that letter, Blavatsky is this is before Besant would arrive in America, and Blavatsky is basically preparing Judge for Besant's arrival and talking and giving accolades to Besant, you know, about her work in the society and how she's going to do great things when she goes, can do great things when she goes to America, and gives a sense of Besant's status in the society at this time. And she does use this word, she does talk about this successor. So it's on this next slide, I think. So Archibald Keatley counters this claim that Besant being Blavatsky's exclusive successor by quoting from the letter of March the 27th. And this is the sentence that Besant was referring to. Blavatsky had written, Judge, she is a most wonderful woman, my right hand, my successor when I will be forced to leave you, my sole hope in England, as you are my sole hope in America. So Keatley felt that given the context of the fuller statement of this sentence, that HBB really desired both Besant and Judge to lead Theosophy in each of their countries successively, or respectively, excuse me. So Keatley was saying that the use of the word successor, which Besant had capitalized, and Blavatsky, as you see here, it is not capitalized, it's lowercase. That so to Keatley, this meant that what Blavatsky was really saying by his interpretation is that Blavatsky wanted both Judge and Besant to lead Theosophy in their own countries, respectively. And she doesn't really say in what capacity Besant might be a successor in this letter too. So that could be left open to interpretation to others too, just based on this letter. And I know I'm going a little late here, so I'm going to just talk a few more things here, and then we're going to bring this to a close because I know it's a little after 10 and want to be respectful of everyone's time if we want to have discussion. So just going to say a few more things here. So Archibald, yeah, he does, and I've already talked about this. Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead here because I just realized where we are. But I also want to point out, and then I think we'll stop after this, because there's a lot. Obviously, I've got how many more slides there? A lot. So sorry, I didn't realize it was going to take this much time. But Judge also evokes Blavatsky. Judge believed that after Blavatsky died, that he was able to remain in communication with her in her after-death states. And he occasionally received messages, and there exists a transcript of a very long message that he received from Blavatsky on January the 3rd, 1895. And in this letter, he talks about several issues that are just really interesting to explore, that are discussed in other areas as well at this time. One, Blavatsky, in this letter, the Blavatsky is expressing Judge's efforts to develop a Western occultism and that those efforts should continue. This was another issue, this development of Western occultism, that would become an antagonistic issue with Besant as well. And the letter is supporting and encouraging a further relationship with Catherine Tingley. And it also cautions Judge that all new esoteric ideas, which may refer to the Western occultism, it's not really explicitly stated, that may be appropriated by the other side after the split. So this is actually in January of 1893, this is probably one of the, that I'm aware of, one of the first documents that says there might be a split coming at the American Convention in April coming up. It was discussed actually by some other members, including Tingley and E.T. Hargrove prior to the April Convention, that this might be a way to go. But as far as we know, this might be the only document stating that there might be a split coming in April. And in fact, there is, so unfortunately. So I'm going to scoot way, way ahead here. I'm going to go to the very end because I'm given our time, let me just sort of wrap this up where we've gone to. Fortunately, I'm not going to get into the governance issues between the TS and the SD. That may have to wait for another day possibly. But I think given this, just this one issue, and having still thrown a lot out there about it, I just want to reiterate some of my initial comments that, again, this isn't meant to, to bring up old antagonisms about some issues of the past. This is really meant to try to gain a deeper understanding of our theosophical past, of understanding of our leaders, both as inspired individuals and also as just human beings with very human characteristics. One aspect of this area that, and also what later generations continue to deal with, is how should members who have never had a relationship with a Mahatma deal with the claims of others who make such a claim. There may be many ways to address this issue, but they may be of value to discuss and talk about and worth thinking about. And as far as I can tell, I'm not aware that HBV necessarily use the master's authority in the way that I have seen some of the later leaders do so, including Judge and Besant, to invoke these figures as indicated in the few examples given. Along with Blavatsky's monumental work, we are used to recognizing her. We are also used to recognizing her very human qualities. Her hot temper, her constant smoking, her spicy language, shall we say, her deferential nature, et cetera, et cetera. We can even look at Olcott's wonderful work and yet still hear stories of his very human foibles as well. But something seems to happen generally to the way we perceive their successors and the way that they were portrayed later on after Blavatsky died and after this split occurred, especially with Besant and Judge after the split. Immediately after, each leader seems to have been hoisted onto a tall pillar that extols all their work that they did in the society to save it from ruin by their antagonist, declared antagonist, I might say. Each leader was seen as the true protagonist, put upon a pillar of infallibility. And you can sort of see this if you read some of the documentation after, within the 50 or so years after the split. You sort of get this sense that they've been put upon, and it's with both of them, that they've been put upon a pillar of infallibility in a way that they are handled, in the way that they handled the challenges during the 1890s. But today we have the advantage of time and many generations between us and the society's original founders and our early pioneers. And while I hope that we do not become historical amnesiacs, I also believe that we can explore these early years, especially anything that might be difficult or challenging for us to explore, and do so in a way that with a healthy dose of humility for their pioneering efforts and without judgments for their very human natures and challenges that they faced. So that's it. I'll conclude with that.